All right, let's talk about some of the problems with zeros. The first major problem with the zero is the mathematical flaw that exists within it. We have a 10-point range for an A 10-point range for a B, 10 points for a C, 10 points for a D, and a 60-point range for an F. So not only is this a dangerous message to send to students, saying that we have 60 ways that you can fail, but only 40 ways that you can be successful, but it also disproportionately weights the F much more heavily than any of the other letter grades. The second flaw is that it destroys student motivation. We know this, we see this all the time in class. When students get zeros, they start doing the math in their head and they figure out, I can no longer get an A in the class. I can no longer get a B in the class. And once they realize they can no longer pass the class because they've accumulated enough zeros, that's when they stop trying, they become behavior problems, and eventually they stop showing up altogether. And clearly that's not what we want. And finally, it reduces the validity of grades and it misrepresents students' actual knowledge. Right? Students, when they get a zero, it suggests that they know absolutely nothing about that particular skill or content. And clearly that's not the case. They just didn't demonstrate it in that situation. So we know the problems with zeros. How do we fix it? And so let's take a look at the alternatives to zero. And the most popular alternative is going to be a 4-point scale. This is used in a lot of elementary schools, middle schools, and even some high schools now, where each letter grade gets an equal weight. So A is a 4-point, B is 3 points, C is 2, D is 1, 0 is F. And so you see here, we actually still have the zero in play, but it's weighted equally with every other letter grade. And as Doug Reeve said back in 2017, it's not the zeros that are the problem. It's a 0 on a 100-point scale that is the academic death penalty. And so if we can get behind this idea that, okay, we can give zeros to students. If they didn't do the work, that's what they've earned. If we can get behind the idea that we want to make that zero worth the same weight as every other letter grade, then everything else starts to fall into place. Unfortunately, this 4-point scale is not an option for us currently in PowerSchool. So we have to come up with an alternative to the alternative. And that's where the 50% not handed in comes in. Right? So again, if we use the scale and we say that every letter grade gets 1 point, we need to convert that to our 100-point scale. And so let's just choose the mid-range A, mid-range B, C, D, and then for an F, we're going to put the base at 50. So a student's grade cannot drop below that 50. And part of the reason why we're able to do this is because mathematically it works out to be the exact same. So whether we're using the 4-point scale or a 100-point scale with a 50 as the base, you're going to see that the end result is the same. So let's imagine for a second that we have this student. And I know that this is not exactly how grades work out, where not every grade is going to be weighted equally, and it's not going to be as clean as this, but just humor me on this for a second. So let's imagine that the student's first 3 assignments, they didn't do for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. But in the next 7, they got an A on each and every one of those. We take a look at that trend, and at the end of the semester or the end of the quarter, we have to assign that student a grade. Right? There's different ways that we could do this, and they're all going to yield slightly different results. And that is part of the inherent flaw with grading is the subjectivity. And we could use PowerSchool to assign the grade. We could take a look at the most recent grades. We could use our own personal judgment. They're all going to be slightly different. But let's use the 4-point scale for a second, where we put in zeros for those first 3 assignments that we're missing. And then we give 4 points for the 7 assignments that were all there. 7 assignments, 4 points each, it's 28 points. We divide by the 10 overall assignments and we get this 2.8, right? And that 2.8 is going to convert to a B on this GPA scale, right? So we're just above that 2.7 there. It's going to be a B minus. So it's going to be a B, right? Now, if we convert that then to a 100-point system using 50%, we're going to get that exact same result. Right? We put in the 50% instead of zeros, put 95% in instead of 4s. We end up with an 81.5. And again, you're going to see right here, it is in line with the B minus, right there between those, right above the 2.7. So mathematically, it is the exact same result. Now, let's imagine that we use the traditional 100-point system with zeros. So we give the student zeros for those first 3, 95s for the next 7. The student ends up with a very different result. That student ends up with a D, and a pretty mediocre D at best. So again, we're going to see that like that's right where we fall. mid-range D. So if we put this into the terms then of a 4-point scale, we have to adjust our calculations a little bit because we already put in the zeros and that gave us a B. So clearly a 0 is not going to work. In order to get the same result on this 4-point scale, we have to put in a -6 for each of those missing assignments. So when a student misses an assignment, it's not just that they're taking a 0, it's that they're actually losing 6 points per assignment, which ultimately has the effect of negating 4.5 assignments. Right? Those 4.5 assignments don't matter anymore because they made a mistake and they didn't do 3 assignments. Right? So mathematically, you can see the impact of using a 0 on a 100-point scale. It's the equivalent of using a -6 on a 4-point scale. Now, this is best case scenario. This is when a student gets an A on every assignment. When it's not an A, it's even more drastic. Right? We see when a student's getting a B on every assignment, but they miss those 3, it's actually the equivalent of -7 on that 4-point scale. Right? So it's really difficult to justify being able to give a 0 on a 100-point scale when this is the impact that it has on students. Now, don't get me wrong. I know the arguments that, if we're giving students 50% for missing assignments, then we're rewarding them for not doing the work. Okay, but truly, it's not giving them credit for not doing the work. It's correcting a flawed grading scale. Right? And that's the important piece to remember here is that truly, we want to hold students accountable, and we will, and we'll find ways to get those assignments in because that's what we ultimately want from them. But we have to give them grades that reflect their knowledge and don't penalize them for mistakes that they make simply because they're teenagers. All right, so really quickly to clarify, this is not going to ensure that all students pass. Talk to any teacher who's using 50%, and they'll tell you that students who don't do the work still end up with Fs in the class. Right? And that's not to tout that as something we should strive for, but it's to say, look, this is not a cure-all that's going to suddenly get every student pass. It's not going to inflate their grades. It's simply going to motivate the students who are on that verge to actually do their work. Students are still receiving an F for the assignment. You're not going to hear students walking through the halls and telling their family and friends, hey, I didn't do the work and I got an F for that assignment. It's 50%, but I got an F. It's not going to happen. Right? From the teacher side of things, you can communicate this really easily to students and parents by marking the assignment as 50% and missing. There's a code in PowerSchool. It's NHI 50%. It shows up as orange for them, and so that way they know it's missing. It's an F and they need to do it. At the end of the day, we want the students to do the work and we want the students to learn. And by using 50%, we're going to encourage that work. We're going to encourage students to complete the work, and we're still going to email parents. We're still going to talk to the students. We're still going to set up time one-on-one to help the students out. So this is not in lieu of all that. Instead, it's in addition to that. So final thoughts that I just want you to think about as you leave. If you are on the fence, or if you're opposed to it right now, I just want you to think about how your gradebook would look different if you put 50% in. Do the students' grades more accurately reflect their knowledge? And more importantly, what happens to student motivation when a student goes from having a 15% in class to having a 52% in class? Right? That student's going to see that they're pretty close now to a D. They're only 8% away. And yeah, they still have a lot of work to do, but they know that it's within reach. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.